Russia is preparing for war with NATO. Whether this war will happen is still uncertain, but NATO must be ready. Ukraine was supposed to be occupied within a week, yet after almost 4 years, the Russians are still unable to capture even all of the Donbass. What does the war in Ukraine teach us? And what conclusions can we draw for Poland and NATO? This question will be answered by analysts from OSW and also by a special guest of this video, the first Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, Lieutenant General Karol Dymanowski. Before we answer the question about the lessons from the war in Ukraine, we have to first ask whether NATO's war with Russia will be at all similar to the war in Ukraine. While much can be learned from the war beyond our eastern border, as we will discuss shortly, it is difficult to speak of a one-to-one transferability. Russia's war with NATO would be significantly different.
First of all, we would not want this war to happen in the first place, because if this war between NATO and the Russian Federation were to occur, it would mean that our allied deterrence is not working. And this, in turn, would mean that either we were not credible in our deterrence, or we incorrectly selected the instruments and tools of deterrence in relation to the potential aggressor. But if this conflict were to occur, I am convinced that this war between NATO and the Russian Federation would certainly not look like the war with Ukraine. First, it would mean that we have not drawn conclusions from this conflict. And second, I think that right from the start, NATO has a completely different potential than Ukraine had at the beginning of the war. We have more people, more equipment, and better people and better equipment. I think we are better prepared for various scenarios in every operational domain, which the Ukrainians were lacking in.
The alliance has greater military force in terms of its concentration than Russian forces. The alliance has very good reconnaissance, very good air forces, so here the preparation for a potential repulsion of a Russian attack will be much better prepared. These NATO forces will be focused on the eastern flank much earlier. NATO will have plans that it is currently developing, forces that should respond to aggressive Russian actions at a much faster pace. The fundamental difference would therefore be the scale of operations, also on the Russian side.
Currently in Ukraine, however shocking this may sound, from the Russian point of view, there is no full-scale war. They are not fully utilizing all the forces and means they could use. Moreover, given the specific support from the West, even for Ukraine, this is not yet a full-scale armed conflict. After all, to this day, not only Russia but Ukraine too has not decided on universal mass mobilization. Another issue is whether it would be able to equip these soldiers, even with Western support. But at least with this universal mass mobilization, there would be a greater likelihood of replenishing human losses, shortages in those units that are on the front. If Ukraine has not yet decided to do this, Russia is even less inclined to do so. Speaking colloquially, this is a half-hearted war, at least from Russia's point of view, because it is clear that for Ukraine, this is definitely a greater effort.
It's surprising that aviation is not being used en masse during the war in Ukraine. In the case of a Russia-NATO war, this would have to change, if only due to NATO's strategy, which will want to conduct this war at a distance.
Ale mamy też piękny militarnie przykład pustynnej burzy.
But we also have a great military example of Desert Storm, where this worked, the so-called air campaign, when American Air Force's naval aviation, but also deep strikes with cruise missiles, destabilized Saddam Hussein's state. They deprived him of the ability to effectively control his own forces by striking data transmission centers, but also deprived these forces of electricity by striking power plants and transformer stations. Then they moved to operational strikes to the rear of the front, on units grouped deep within the defensive lines, until, on the eve of the beginning of the ground phase of Operation Desert Storm, they began destroying individual units. Coalition forces intended to liberate Kuwait began entering. This supported the conduct of operations through directly supported attacks, meaning if our forces encountered a point of resistance that they could not overcome with their own strength, they would call for air support, which was constantly circling over the battlefield and carried out strikes. So this is the style in which primarily the Americans, but therefore more broadly NATO, wants to conduct conflict and which it wants to impose on its opponent. Because if the opponent does not address this very aggressive style of conducting an air campaign, building their air defenses, trying to counter it, then their state will simply be undermined or destroyed. So there is the dispersion of the opponent's potential. In the military, it's not about creating problems, but dilemmas. A problem has some solution. A dilemma has more than one solution, and usually all are equally bad.
However, despite these differences, we can draw a lot from the experience of the war in Ukraine, and this is clear from the first days of the war. On February 24, 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. One of the main directions of attack was Kyiv. The Russian goal was clear: to effect a change of government through the physical capture or elimination of Zelensky. Many at the time were convinced that the Russian operation would end in quick success. Meanwhile, after more than a month of fighting, the Russians withdrew from Kyiv, thereby losing this stage of the war. So why then did the Russians lose? Part of the answer may be analytical errors that led to them underestimating their opponent.
Nevertheless, it was surprising for us as analysts, for us as military personnel, how the Russian Federation prepared for this operation in Ukraine, and how many analytical errors they made at the very beginning. And these analytical errors translated into faulty political decisions, which in turn translated into incorrect operational planning, and this in turn into a poor selection of forces for the implementation of this operation. And those initial successes that the Russians achieved very quickly were later indeed stopped due to the incorrectly selected forces, incorrectly prepared plans, and incorrect decisions resulting from incorrect intelligence analyses. It is difficult to say whether this really resulted from purely analytical errors, from poor reconnaissance and intelligence data collected by the Russians, or rather from the organizational culture and how the regime exerts pressure on its analysts. Nevertheless, we saw the effects. The armed forces of the Russian Federation were not prepared for what they encountered in Ukraine.
We see this in what happened in the first days, or rather what did not happen. Russia, surprisingly, did not massively use its aviation, which could have facilitated ground forces operations.
I partly assess that this resulted from the fact that the Russians did not anticipate this kind of resistance, did not anticipate that it would take so long, that this war would last so long. They did not anticipate that the world, that is, the collective West, would support Ukraine to such an extent. If they had anticipated this, they would certainly have prepared a completely different plan and completely different forces to achieve dominance in all operational domains, including the air domain.
And this is precisely the first conclusion we must emphasize. NATO should heed the proper reconnaissance. On the one hand, bad reconnaissance leads to mistakes on the part of the Russians, and on the other hand, effective reconnaissance helps Ukrainians choose the right approach to the war.
First of all, the Ukrainians did not let themselves be drawn into the maneuver warfare that the Russians tried to impose. They simply knew that they were weaker, or perhaps their Western partners explained to the Ukrainians that this would not turn out well. Moreover, actions at a lower tactical level, when some maneuver actions were taken by the Ukrainians, they did not end well for them. However, knowing practically everything about these Russians, they were able to withdraw units from under Russian strike, because they knew where it would happen, when more or less some serious strike would happen, and they themselves were able to bite back very seriously. The Russians entered Ukraine as if it were a military exercise. It was even in many respects for them some continuation of exercises, because battalion tactical groups were commanded by brigade or divisional regiment commanders, that is, as in exercises, not by an appointed battalion commander. The war was to end quickly. Soldiers would gain stripes, maybe additional Gerasimov stars. In many cases, they might have received them, but posthumously. The Ukrainians magnificently exploited this, still having at their disposal weapons transferred from the West and this reconnaissance knowledge. This decided that in the first months of the war, the Russians began to lose generals and staffs, entire units sent to Ukraine. This is not yet a conflict on a global scale, such as World Wars I and II, but it is the first such fairly large conflict in which the sides know practically everything about each other and their movements. Whereas during World War I, those trenches were driven into the ground by firepower, that is, the previously unknown power of artillery on both sides. At this time, those forces have been driven into trenches primarily by ubiquitous reconnaissance at every possible level and from every possible side.
Rola rozpoznania zawsze była kluczowa. Od pierwszych dni wojskowości wiedzy.
The role of reconnaissance has always been crucial, from the first days of the art of war. To know what your opponent is doing is the most important knowledge in the world. Now this reconnaissance has become available like never before, and this can be called the biggest change of this conflict, that today practically everyone, every larger group of soldiers, let's not even call it a subunit, but every larger group of soldiers has access to some reconnaissance system that is able to tell them what is around the corner. This most likely prevents the restoration of maneuver operations, alongside the lack of scale, because both sides know each other. Both sides therefore also have difficulty in secretly building this mass of reserves, especially in the rear. Command posts, whether battalion or brigade, must remain dispersed and in motion, which reduces their effectiveness. It's much easier for officers to conduct operations of their formation when they're all sitting in one tent or in one building, next to each other, and are able to communicate much faster than through telephones or laptops. A way to counter the threat of reconnaissance is dispersion, physical reduction, remaining in motion, which exhausts these officers. Not only do they have to constantly move by car, during this travel they often have to perform command staff tasks, and they are susceptible to jamming, so the effectiveness of staff work is significantly reduced.
The West is already drawing conclusions from this situation. Artificial intelligence will help in situations where people are overloaded. And this would mean a partial automation of command systems using AI.
This is already happening in NATO countries. Americans are not the only ones leading here. The British and French are also doing it. These systems based on artificial intelligence algorithms would make suggestions to lower-level commanders the options they could execute, taking into account what resources they have, what information there is. It is also intended to support so-called data fusion. Currently, all military personnel are experiencing an information overload. There is so much information that the human mind is not able to simultaneously conduct combat, being stressed, threatened, sleep-deprived and undernourished, and still collect and process this information. There is too much of it. So these algorithms are needed and are already being developed by several companies, we will not mention which ones exactly, that deal with this, to put this information into more digestible data packages, and not just for trained officers, so that everyone can work more easily with this information and develop decisions that translate into tactical actions. There is no escape from technology. It will support our analytical processes and our decision-making processes. It will not replace the human factor from military operations, but it will certainly allow us to make decisions faster and to better analyze data that will flow in ever-increasing quantities to our analysts.
Let's return to the first weeks of the war. There is another reason why the Russians withdrew from Kyiv after more than a month.
The Russians did not take care of proper logistics. It was improperly prepared and planned, and they were later unable to deliver logistics to fighting forces on time, which slowed their pace and reduced the scale of operations. And as a result, the Russians had to hand Ukraine back those territorial gains that they achieved in the first weeks and months. However, I think that this also resulted largely from the fact that the Russians planned this operation poorly, because they erroneously assessed the opponent. They underestimated the opponent and overestimated themselves. I think that once again the importance of logistics was highlighted. From tactical logistics, this means delivering supplies to forces fighting on the front line. Through operational logistics, this is building a logistics system for the entire theatre of operations, to strategic logistics, which will ensure the continuity of the functioning of the armed forces and its state in conditions of war. By strategic logistics, I mean not only delivering and supplying forces, but also production capabilities, repair capabilities, service capabilities, to maintain the pace and scale of operations. This is particularly important when we stand against an opponent such as the Russian Federation.
Taking care of logistics and its appropriate preparation is already one of the very important conclusions. This means, for example, building NATO pipelines. We wrote about this more extensively in one of our texts. The link is in the description. We talked about artificial intelligence, but now let's deepen the topic of technology in general and its use during the war. First, let's answer the question of whether this war is at all extraordinary in this degree.
Nie wydaje mi się, żebyśmy tę wojnę nazwali wojną nowej ery.
I don't think we would call this a war of a new era. In my opinion, the war in Ukraine shows that this is a clash between the old with the new. By old, I mean that we still need force and scale. Various armored and artillery capabilities are still necessary to achieve success on the battlefield. But on the other hand, we have several novelties that show that a breakthrough is occurring, and this breakthrough is increasingly entering and leaving a mark on the battlefield. I think that the clearest example, if we refer to the war in Ukraine, is of course the increasingly wider use of drones on the battlefield.
And here we arrive at another important element, namely drones. First, let's explain why unmanned aerial vehicles are so important in this conflict.
W wymiarze taktycznym
In the tactical dimension, the proliferation and mass production of unmanned vehicles is a great asset. However, they are a response to weakness, to the lack of a mass force, to soldiers on the battlefield. They are a response to the lack of modern equipment and the capabilities of this equipment.
The role of drones in a potential NATO-Russia war may therefore look different and not be as crucial.
z perspektywy szerszego Sojuszu Północnoatlantyckiego, który jest
From the perspective of the broader North Atlantic Alliance, it's an alliance based on air power and aviation. This means airstrikes with precision weapons from very long range, but also, thanks to the Americans, it also means strategic bomb raids. The North Atlantic Alliance does not have to develop long-range unmanned vehicles as Ukraine does, because already today, and actually for almost 40 years, it has had either Tomahawk cruise missiles or ballistic missiles such as ATACMS, or in the near future some precision strike missile, or finally an air force that, thanks to stealth capabilities, is able to penetrate deep into enemy air defense and conduct airstrikes using much larger and heavier air attack means, such as precision aircraft bombs.
However, this of course does not mean that drones are not important. Their role may be different than in Ukraine, but this is still an important technology that, as this war shows, we'll need to develop.
Ta dronizacja pola walki to jest trend, który obserwujemy od kilku dziesięciu.
The use of drones on the battlefield is a trend we have been observing for several decades. But indeed, the war in Ukraine has shown us that, especially at the tactical level, at the level of an individual soldier, squad, platoon, company, these drones are an essential element of combat. Above all, they supplement our reconnaissance capabilities, but also expand our arsenal when it comes to striking the enemy. It's a very important capability. However, I think these drones are not that game changer. They are not the technology that will tip the scale of victory to one side or the other. But they have the potential to become one in the future, especially if they gain greater autonomy and are powered by artificial intelligence systems. That's first. Secondly, I think many lessons flow not only from the tactical use of drones, but also from how to prepare these drones for war, how to manage them during a war, how to acquire and implement them into fighting forces. Many lessons can be learned from this. That's why we, as the armed forces of the Republic of Poland, like the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Poland, have already introduced a number of changes as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, but also as a result of earlier work on drone acquisition procedures, on the organization of drone forces in the ministry and in the general staff. This concerns all types of drone capability tiers, from those strategic drones through operational drones to tactical drones and first-person view drones.
When building our capabilities, we must remember the rapid development of technology and build them in a smart way.
Powinniśmy przede wszystkim rozbudować nasze zdolności do produkcji dronów.
We should primarily encourage our capabilities for drone production, for providing the armed forces with a very large number of drones in a very short time. Because on the battlefield, these technologies that are used in drones will quickly be out of date, so we will have to be ready to very quickly modernize and upgrade, using IT terminology, and to throw these subsequent waves of drones into combat. This is an extremely important element, building the capability to produce a large number of drones in a very short time. This takes into account the very short cycle of usefulness of this armament on the battlefield. I am especially referring to these smallest tactical drones.
I to jak wygląda obraz wojny bez załogowców.
Drone warfare will not look like it does today in 4 months' time. Here the changes are very fast, so again, drawing conclusions from how drone warfare looks today and trying to translate them to NATO forces is a mistake, because we have not yet reached the point where this development has stabilized. Therefore, drawing conclusions from Ukraine and today's drone warfare and starting the rapid production of cheap, unmanned vehicles will be a mistake. But this will become apparent in 4 months. No one is predicting that Russia will attack Poland or, more broadly, a NATO state on 1 day's notice, so there is no need to build 1 million drones per year, much less 12 million drones per year. Especially since drones produced in Ukraine or used on the Ukrainian battlefield have a very short so-called shelf life. That is, to put it crudely, expiration date. They are made by cottage industry methods, and you cannot put them on a shelf to wait for a year, 2, 12, or even 20 years. So, drawing a conclusion that drones must be mass-produced and producing 2 million drones for millions, hundreds of millions of zloty, or even billions of zloty, only to produce 2 million more in a year's time because these will corrode, they are cheap and have no protection, including against corrosion. This is pointless. Production capabilities must be built, which is already happening. This means implementing 3D printers and the ability among soldiers and selected civilian groups to produce cheap unmanned vehicles for training needs. Again, hundreds of thousands of these unmanned vehicles per year are not needed. A few thousand or tens of thousands are enough, depending on the scale of exercises we would like to conduct. So one must also constantly remember that no NATO state is currently at war, and peacetime states and societies are subject to completely different regimes and needs than those of wartime states and societies.
What is also important is how to use drones, and this, in turn, brings a number of other detailed tactical aspects to light. Here, too, we are already learning lessons from Ukraine's actions.
Niektóre lekcje są bardzo praktyczne I bardzo przydatne.
Some are very practical and very useful, and we are introducing them into the training cycle of our forces and our soldiers as well. We are talking about very basic tactical elements, trench warfare, combat in organized terrain. We are also talking about using drones at these lowest levels of command, because these Ukrainian experiences are truly invaluable. But we are also talking about the organization, for example, of command posts, their dispersion, minimizing their thermal and electromagnetic signature, meaning their camouflage, and making detection by the opponent difficult, and a number of tactical solutions that, although not directly transferable, will nevertheless be very useful, and are already being used by our soldiers in training and by our planners in preparing potential military response options to possible aggression.
Anti-drone capabilities are also extremely important.
Mamy tutaj kilka obserwacji operacyjnych, taktycznych, czyli jak tą...
We already have several operational and tactical observations, that is, how to prepare this defense, how to plan it, but also a number of technical observations, which systems are most effective, which give the best detectability, etc., which systems give the best neutralization of enemy drones. For example, I can say that drone detection is not just one system. It is a conglomerate of several systems operating in different frequency bands. And this gives us, perhaps not so much a guarantee, but minimizes the risk of failure to detect a drone to an acceptable threat level. This is both passive radars, expand radars, and acoustic sensors. As for drone combat now, here too we see the need to develop two elements in parallel. The kinetic element, small caliber weapons, missile weapons, but also the non-kinetic element, that is, electronic warfare systems, directed energy systems, and laser systems.
New technologies also bring challenges and questions about communications.
Jednym z kluczowych lekcji, którą my wyciągamy z tego konfliktu w Ukrainie,
One of the key lessons we draw from this conflict in Ukraine is resolving the communication dilemma of whether to bet on its secrecy or on speed. Especially at low tactical levels of command, the Ukrainians choose speed. Many communication systems function in open applications based on mobile telephony, which significantly speeds up data transmission, but also data collection, not only from intelligence, reconnaissance, military sensors, but from ordinary citizens who feed this system built precisely on mobile telephony with information. That's one thing. The second extremely important thing when it comes to communication is the use of civilian satellite communication systems, including Starlinks, to maintain this communication. Large antennas radiating electromagnetic energy are a very easy target for the Russians and will be a very easy target for any of our opponents. So this is certainly an important lesson when it comes to organizing communication systems.
We've talked a lot about new technologies, but one of the conclusions of this war is that technological novelties are not the only important issue. A huge role was played by electronic warfare, which has decades of history.
Pierwszy raz na taką skalę w konfliktach, jak znaczenie systemów walki radioelektronicznej.
Electronic warfare systems have, of course, been well known. These jamming systems appeared already during World War II, and attempts to use and develop this technology lasted throughout the Cold War period. In Soviet times, great emphasis was placed on the development of radioelectronic warfare systems. However, this is the first conflict in which the Russians could use this on a large scale and with great success. And one could say that it somewhat reversed the situation for us. Up to a certain point, very modern solutions such as GPS-guided means, GPS-guided aircraft bombs, GMLRS missiles used by Ukrainians from HIMARS launchers, multiple rocket launchers, something that even before 2022 was the world's best, the most modern solution. It gave the possibility of precise missile targeting and was based on classic satellite communications. When the Russians started jamming this GPS signal very effectively, it reduces these HIMARS to the level of Cold War technology. It still has very significant importance. As long as the Russians do not introduce a jamming system, it is one of the elements that helped Ukrainians expel the Russians from the right bank of the Dnipro and regain part of Kherson Oblast. However, in the further course of fighting, it turned out that modern reconnaissance systems are not entirely as effective.
radioelektroniczna wróciła na...
Electronic warfare has returned to the podium. It has shown that it is an essential element in conducting operations, especially in such a dense electromagnetic environment, when many systems depend on access to the electromagnetic spectrum and draw data through the electromagnetic spectrum. Electronic warfare affects the continuity of command or the lack of this continuity, and the accuracy of strike systems. This is an extremely important and significant element.
This war has also shown how important non-kinetic threats are. To put it in simple terms, these are all the non-military operations of the opponent. These can be cyber attacks and various disinformation operations or sabotage. What's important, however, is that the enemy can undertake these actions even before direct military confrontation takes place.
Tylko pamiętajmy o jednym, możemy wziąć, patrzymy na incydenty w Europie związane z działaniami.
We must remember, and looking at incidents in Europe related to so-called Russian hybrid actions, all of these tactics are used in Ukraine. This is simply yet another weapon. This is a tool that is already being used on a daily basis. These are not sporadic incidents. What the Ukrainians are doing to counter this is also an important lesson in this war. They are not so much defending themselves, but from a certain period they began acting similarly to the Russians. The Russian digital sphere is constantly subjected to attacks from the Ukrainian side, and with great success. It's about paralyzing communications, stealing data, striking at Russian corporations or companies that support the defense industry, obtaining information, and even physically destroying digital communications on the Russian side.
Ja bym chciał tylko zwrócić uwagę, że
I have to point out that cyberspace, due to its specificity, must take into account several aspects that do not necessarily have to be considered in these classic operational military domains. The first is its close civil-military cooperation, because it is impossible to set clear boundaries between civilian and military cyberspace. Second is having a good balance of defensive as well as offensive capabilities, that is, for a potential attack on the opponent. And the third thing is maintaining the continuity of these capabilities, meaning we must be ready already in peacetime to defend ourselves here, and possibly, if such a political decision were made, to attack in crisis and war. So this continuity must be absolutely maintained throughout the conflict continuum, as we call it in military theory.
Ten cyberfront muszę traktować jako w sumie już kolejny front wojny.
The cyber front must be treated as yet another front of war. This is directly related to conducting strictly war-related actions, because paralyzing the opponent's communications or logistics is an essential task. This includes, for example, as we recently saw, a paralysis of Russian rail transport, when train movement was disrupted and for a period of time trains had to be stopped, because the entire digital infrastructure related to controlling railway crossings simply was not functioning.
But the goal of Russian actions in cyberspace is often to sow chaos and demotivate society.
W momencie, kiedy Rosjanie sparaliżowali na ponad tydzień.
Like when the Russians, for over a week, paralyzed the operations of the mobile phone operator Kyivstar, but also electronic services provided by this operator. This causes huge difficulties in social life. It's about accessing bank accounts and so on. Yet another sphere is attacking strictly banking services. We know that when a person is accustomed to easy access to money, electronically, they get used to it because it's convenient. In case of war, one must remember that it's better to have cash. Here you don't know the day or hour when such an attack may prove successful. Another matter is, of course, disruptions, and here it must be pointed out that the Russians are already conducting these actions in Europe, not only in Ukraine, and likewise in Poland. Recently, a lot of attention has been given to securing critical infrastructure, because digital attacks are rampant and concern networks. Their goal is to disrupt the operation of energy networks, water supply systems, or generally to disrupt the working of the internet. And we all know that guaranteeing security in the digital space in general is also one of the necessary conditions for conducting combat operations, like in the case of the famous Starlinks in Ukraine that their army uses.
The intelligence services also operate during wartime. And here too, the war in Ukraine brings interesting conclusions.
Rosjanie, to co też jest już powszechnie wiadomo, zmienili.
The Russians, which is also already commonly known, have somewhat changed their recruitment methods of collaborators to a remote model, that is, through messenger and social media networks. For example, they make offers to people to perform jobs commissioned in Ukraine through Telegram. This is still a big problem, and it is also interesting because it relates to the fact that there are people with pro-Russian views there. However, these are mostly people who are interested in a quick profit. The Russians at some point started focusing on young people, on persons under 18, and although they commissioned fairly small things, there were many of them. For example, setting fire to a car, scattering leaflets, etc. And nearly every day, Ukrainian intelligence reports that they detain someone for remote cooperation with Russian intelligence. That's one thing, these sabotages, diversions. But the second, very important thing for the Russians is finding people who share military information. This is primarily about the deployment of units, but also about how Ukrainian logistics work. Where are the facilities that produce drones? These facilities are dispersed and remain a potential target for Russian air attacks.
When we think about recruitment conducted by the intelligence services, often the first association is that their targets are generals, officers, or other people with access to important information. However, today the target is increasingly ordinary citizens.
Ta skala jest duża, że właśnie ludzie, którzy
This is done on a large scale. There are people who are not the typical intelligence agents, but for various reasons, these are primarily financial reasons, they decide to get involved in actions of sabotage. This effectiveness is indeed limited, but honestly speaking, it is also painful and sometimes, for military reasons, very dangerous. If we're talking about military reconnaissance, the Russians have not given up on this.
Recruitment takes place, as we mentioned, using modern technology, including online messaging apps. However, even here, more traditional methods are sometimes helpful.
Rosjanie się posuwają do takich znanych w historii sposobów.
The Russians resort to more hands-on methods known from history. For example, near the broadly understood front area, leaflets were dropped, as I understand, by drones, and they looked like Ukrainian banknotes. From a distance they looked real, but on the back there was information on how to remotely get in touch to earn money. These are the tactics, we know them anecdotally, but the Russians do this. And the conclusion from this is that when military operations are conducted, the role of counterintelligence increases because the opponent is interested in destabilizing the rear.
And finally, we move to the strategic level. What conclusions can be drawn from the war in Ukraine here?
Z kolei po stronie ukraińskim pokazałbym na jedną rzecz, która
On the Ukrainian side, I would point to one thing that perhaps did not so much surprise us, but rather showed us an old truth. But it seems it was not properly addressed by the Ukrainians at the beginning of the conflict. Namely, the timely mobilization of human resources so that in those decisive first days and weeks of the war, they would have the human potential to stop the Russian onslaught in every clash. Mass is very important, and the Ukrainians lacked this somewhat. I understand that the political background, this reluctance to escalate on the part of the Ukrainian authorities, prevented them from making this mobilization decision. But we saw that this had a huge impact on how the fighting looked in the first days, in the first weeks. So the first conclusion that flows from this for us is finding the right balance between intelligent forces and mass forces. If there were to be a conflict with the Russian Federation or another symmetric opponent, we would of course level all numerical asymmetries with technologies, training and operational planning. But we still need this mass. Hence the plans to develop the size of the Polish army. As for major strategic observations, above all, what should not surprise us here in Poland, in our geographical location and with our history, is that we have confirmed our belief that Russia's intentions, their strategic goals, have not de facto changed for centuries. This is a very important issue. So let's not expect them to change in the coming years or decades. That's one thing. Secondly, we have also confirmed that the Russians very often use their instrument of power, which is the armed forces, to achieve their political goals. Economically or diplomatically, they have little to offer countries like Poland or other Central and Eastern European states. So they will choose this military instrument to achieve their goals. This conflict has also shown that despite all kinds of innovations in their armed forces, they will still include mass and force in their calculations, and we must oppose this. That's why we should develop our armed forces precisely in this way. This is a very important conclusion. If we're talking about strategic observations for state defense, it should be emphasized that the armed forces will be an extremely important key element, but not the only one. If there is a war, the entire state fights, not just its armed forces. The costs we are now bearing for the modernization and transformation of the Polish army are considerable, among the highest in NATO. This is very good. But it's better to pay for deterrence now than to incur the huge costs associated with defense later on. So we should absolutely not refrain from increasing our defense budget if there is such a need, because this is a very important element of deterrence. Since we're already talking about deterrence, I want to emphasize something extremely important. In deterrence theory, we speak of two main types: deterrence by denial and offensive deterrence. That is, deterrence by punishment. In our assessment, the conflict in Ukraine has shown that in relation to Russia, deterrence by punishment will be extremely important and de facto the key factor, which in military language can be translated as the ability for precision strikes at long distances. We will need these types of systems, and we should base our defense and deterrence strategy on this.
Myślę, że wojna na Ukrainie pokazała nam.
The war in Ukraine has shown us several things. On the one hand, it has shown that Russia is not the military superpower that a large part of the Allies, also at the military level, considered it to be. The war is in its 4th year, and Russia is very far from fulfilling its military objectives. Let's remember, winter-spring 2022, a large part of the Allies, also at the military level, believed that Russia would conquer Ukraine in 3 days, and that we would be dealing with Russia on our border, which would be a direct threat to us. In the 4th year of the war, Russia, despite, of course, certain advances in the Donbass, is still engaged in the territory of eastern and southern Ukraine, and has not achieved spectacular strategic successes there. This shows that Russia has its limitations, that we can beat Russia, and even Ukraine would be able to beat Russia if the West had decided much earlier on much larger deliveries of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine, without fearing nuclear escalation from Russia, which was Russia's scare tactic against the West to stop it from helping sufficiently. So certainly it's a lesson for public opinion in NATO, because I think that the military level knows it already. So Russia is not as strong as we thought, but of course it should not be underestimated, especially in its potential for breaking up allies, breaking up allied unity, solidarity, influencing the decision-making processes, and using this with some provocative or military actions against NATO member states. In this film, we have tried to talk about the conclusions that can be drawn from the war in Ukraine. These are lessons important not only for winning a potential war, but also, and perhaps above all, for preventing it from happening in the first place.
To czy będzie wojna z Rosją, tak naprawdę zależy od nas.
Whether there will be a war with Russia really depends primarily on us, and not as much on Russia. First, on how Russia reads us politically. That is, whether we maintain NATO cohesion, whether we maintain good transatlantic relations, whether American forces, despite expected reductions, will nevertheless remain in Europe, and whether the Europeans will quickly make up for the gaps that the Americans will leave and which have been identified as weak spots in NATO defense plans. So here we have two perspectives or levels. On the one hand, there is the political level, where the cohesion of the alliance is important, the solidarity between member states regarding the assessment of Russia's actions and ways of responding to them. And on the other hand, there is the military level, where we should demonstrate our efficiency, effectiveness of military action, our military capabilities to defend our territory, such as those resulting from NATO defense plans. These were decided and accepted at the last Alliance Summit in Vilnius, in Washington, and in The Hague. We are dealing with a process of strengthening collective defense in NATO. If we have political cohesion among alliance members, if we have rapid military modernization with the readiness of the armed forces to defend allied territory, then it's unlikely that Russia will attack the alliance, because it realizes that it's much weaker than a cohesive, solid alliance. But if Russia has the conviction that through such an attack it can create divisions in the alliance, that this alliance will not respond jointly, will not respond as a whole, but will be divided, and the attacked members will try to defend themselves alone or in some smaller coalitions. If Russia believes that it can lead to some peace negotiations with the Allies and not to a decisive response from NATO, then it may try to undertake military action against the alliance, believing that it will win. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at our other stories on screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.